From reopening the government to changing political leadership, how the headlines impacted Arizona.
When we have these big events, we learn a lot about how government really affects our day-to-day lives.
Lengthy backlogs in immigration courts stretched even further by the shutdown.
Most likely those trial dates are going to be bumped up to the back of the line.
Plus, a migrant aid group's tactics land its volunteers in federal court.
We succeeded in putting the border crisis on trial.
Hello and welcome to Arizona 360. I'm Lorraine Rivera. Thank you for joining us. The new year got off to a busy start with the longest government shutdown in history and the potential for another one in a few weeks. Plus, legislators in Arizona started their session with a looming deadline to approve a drought contingency plan for the Colorado River. We look back at January's headlines with a journalist roundtable that includes the Yellow Sheet's Hank Stevenson, the Arizona Daily Star's Sarah Garrett Gasson, and the Green Valley News Sahuarita Sun's Dan Shear. We're witnesses to history in our worlds as journalists, this time the longest partial government shutdown. What did we learn from this? What did we take away from this as journalists covering this story? Dan, you want to start?
I think we learned an awful lot, and to me, that adage of a lot of people being one paycheck away from the streets was true. It was very interesting to see how many people were struggling because they missed a pay period. And what we also learned was that the local community will step up and help. We had a lot of local efforts, people giving to the food bank. The town of Sahuarita gave money to the food bank because the food bank was having a run. We also learned that the federal government affects us a lot more than we think because Madera Canyon, the trash was overflowing, even though there were volunteers out there trying to help out. Tumacacaree closed down. I know some parks stayed open, but for the most part, when we have these big events, we learn a lot about how government really affects our day-to-day lives. Lots of lessons in this one.
A federal shutdown, it doesn't just affect federal workers, it affects contractors, it affects people who have ties to the government even when they're not direct. So I think it showed the gulf between everyday Americans doing a job that they thought was secure for the government, and then just the absolute lack of understanding from the people in charge of whether these people get to go back to work or not.
Hank, was the state prepared to step in and support? I know Governor Ducey said we're going to keep the Grand Canyon open, but at the local level, the families who are really impacted, did the state do anything to support their needs?
Yeah, like the state, as you said, kept the Grand Canyon open, which was a big headline, and it's important for the communities up there, the economy up there. But as far as like the actual, family that's being impacted, there wasn't a lot that the state could step in and do. Our food stamp system, it doesn't provide a whole lot. I think people were really looking towards churches, towards community organizations, towards food banks, things like that. And the state wasn't rushing in to kind of try to backfill those federal funds that are usually used to support kind of the working poor.
This is all over the border. This is our region, our community that we all cover so well. We've continued to see the images of people breaching the border to come into the United States. Does the average American now understand the situation, given that it's outside of Arizona, Texas, California? Now it's in the mainstream media all over.
And my colleague Tim Steller, in a recent column, talked about how we think of ranchers. What do ranchers want? And it's one or two families that don't speak for every rancher and every person who does live along the border. So I think the drama of the border, the wall, the border security, all of that coming out of President Trump in the White House and members of Congress and the Senate, kind of making it that shortcut, that image, I think that image, if you're not familiar with what is actually happening on the ground, is still very potent because it plays to fear. It plays to, if you don't want the wall, you don't want border security, and that's what I'm fighting for.
You can find any media to support your perception of what you think is going on at the wall, any media. The question is your perception accurate? And there's plenty of information and plenty of factual information, good reporting that's been done that will give you an accurate idea of what's going on at the wall. Do you really care to know that? So do people really know? The real question is, do people really care?
The conversation then turned to the drought contingency plan, which lawmakers needed to approve by a January 31st deadline imposed by the federal government. Our discussion focused on greater conservation efforts left out of the latest plan.
In terms of one of the arguments up at the Capitol was, if it's more expensive for farmers and ranchers to produce their crops and livestock, it's going to funnel down to the prices at the grocery store, which makes total sense. But water is finite, and yes, it can be recharged and conservation and all of that, but it's a limited resource. And so I think that we would do better to look at the long range rather than immediate concerns. And I think part of the result is that we've pushed it to the last minute and acting out of, we don't want the feds to get involved. And it doesn't lend itself for a really thorough, balanced, thoughtful process.
This should have been the very first piece of legislation filed. It should have been done last year. If not, it should have been the very first piece of legislation filed this year. Lawmakers should have been attacking it when they first got back into session. Instead, there's been these kind of behind-the-scenes meetings for the last couple of weeks trying to hammer out final details, and at the end of the day, the plan is pretty much what we've been talking about for a long time. It's, not a very long-sighted plan. It's essentially, paying for water in different ways.
You mentioned that this should have been done last session. The governor, it was February of last year, put out a plan on this, and it was just 5 or 6 pages. It was very fairly shallow, but at least it was supposed to get the conversation going. And maybe it didn't get going because it was an election year and people wanted to use that against him. They didn't want him to have a win. I don't know why, but I'm stymied that Arizona has not been serious about this for many, many decades, and it should have been.
All right, hang tight. We'll be right back with another conversation, including an election that took place this weekend. At the start of the year, just a few weeks into the shutdown, we asked Brint Milward to explain what it would take for the government to reopen. He's head of the University of Arizona School of Government and Public Policy. This week, Milward joined us again to talk about the shutdown's outcome and this month's deadline for a deal on border security.
I think what happened was sanity sort of prevailed. You had TSA agents who were calling in sick. You had air traffic controllers that were saying we can't keep the system up much longer. You had major airports in the New York area who delayed flights. This is the kind of thing that no political system can stand. Air traffic control, border security, things like that seem to be at risk in a shutdown.
How easy is it for the government to flip the switch, people to start getting paid and back to business as usual?
It's not easy at all. First of all, you've got 800,000 people who have to come back to work. They have to flip on the switch. Some of them have thousands of emails they've got to answer, all kinds of reports that have due dates that didn't stop while they were gone. You have contractors who are not going to get paid like the federal employees. You have cooks, you have custodians at every federal facility in the United States who literally are on minimum wage or not much better. Yeah. They have to come back to work and they don't have any back pay at all.
How did this affect Arizona, specifically perhaps southern Arizona?
The effect in Tucson is greater than anywhere else in the state. We have 3.3% of our workforce in Tucson are civilian government employees. Phoenix is only 1.1%. So that's 13,000 civil servants who did not get paid, who were not doing their jobs, who were not cleaning up at the national parks and monuments.
Based on what we've seen these last few weeks, what's the likeliness of the sides coming together to strike a deal? And immigration is, the elephant in the room.
Well, I'm very optimistic about the Joint Appropriations Committee of the House and the Senate working together to come up with a bipartisan bill. This would be the Homeland Security bill that would include border security. They agree on a lot of things. These are grown-ups. These are people who in the past have approved across the aisle various things. They need immigration judges. They need more technology at ports of entry. They need more personnel. They need more humane facilities for migrants. All those things I think they can agree on. What I think they can't agree on is $5.7 billion for a border, for 263-mile border wall that it's not clear where it's going, what it's going to do, what effect it's going to have. And frankly, we could have another shutdown over a matter of semantics because the president won't agree.
What are the effects of all this? I mean, how will this be remembered?
Well, $3 billion direct losses. There are untold, I have no way, and I don't think anybody has any way of calculating the cost to the contractors who won't be paid. Clearly, there's a lot of lost revenue in the private sector. The airlines took a hit, hotels took a hit, restaurants took a hit, tourism took a hit. All of these kinds of things, you know, have an effect and ripple through the economy. So it certainly doesn't do anything good. The government gets behind. They have to try and catch up. Toxic waste dumps aren't cleaned up. Design work for NASA, for new satellites stops. Those are the kinds of things that are very hard to put a price tag on, but clearly are going to have an effect. And if we have another one, I mean, it really raises questions about the legitimacy of government.
Okay, Brint, thank you. For the thousands of immigrants who've come to the U.S. in recent weeks seeking asylum, their claims join the backlog of hundreds of thousands of cases in immigration court. That issue was exacerbated by the shutdown as about 3/4 of the country's immigration judges were furloughed. We learn more from Ashley Tabaddor, president of the National Association of Immigration Judges. She joins us from Los Angeles via Skype. Judge Tabaddor, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
What are the lasting impacts of this government shutdown on the backlog that you and your colleagues are seeing?
Well, we're still trying to rev up and focus on the cases that are currently scheduled. Otherwise, we have about 80,000 hearings that were canceled, and those hearings will have to be reincorporated back into our docket. And we haven't begun that process yet. It is likely going to take months and months before those cases can be put back on our calendars. And for the people who had trial dates during the shutdown, most likely those trial dates are going to be bumped up to the back of the line. So that means a person will have to wait another 2 or 3 or more years before they can present their cases again.
There are a multitude of factors that you consider when processing a person's case and deciding who stays and who has to leave.
Yes, each case has to be decided on the merit of the facts of the case and the law of the case. So someone who is asking to stay because they're fearful of going back to their home country has a different set of factors that they have to show to the court than someone who's asking to stay because of their family relationships and the number of years that they've been in the United States. So, for example, an asylum seeker must show that they have a fear of persecution based on limited reasons. So that person's case is going to be very much focused on their past experiences in their home country or what they fear is going to happen to them when they return. In contrast, someone who is asking to stay because of the family relationships that have been formed while living in the United States will have to show what we call usually exceptional and extremely unusual hardship to those family members who are United States citizens or lawful permanent resident. So that person has to show that they haven't engaged in criminal activity, that their life here is so critical to those individuals that are here with status.
We often hear this, especially in light of the current conversation. If we have more immigration judges, that will help fix this problem. Is that how you view this issue?
I think having more resources and more immigration judges is part of the solution. But the problem is that we have an immigration court that's situated in the Justice Department. Our courts have to be independent of our prosecutor, independent of the parties who come before us. What we have seen is the court being used as a political tool, as an extension of law enforcement policies. And those usage of the court has consistently added to the backlog. So until we remove the court from the Justice Department, it doesn't matter how many additional immigration judges you add to it, that backlog is going to be compounded. We have seen the largest growth in court. We have grown from under 300 judges to over 400 judges. But our backlog has grown from over 600,000 cases to over 800,000 cases. So I think that's pretty clear evidence that, yes, we need more judges because there are obviously more cases, but just having more judges, just throwing more money at it is not going to solve the problem.
Okay, Judge Tabaddor joining us via Skype from Los Angeles. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
We can try to mitigate the suffering and death.
4 volunteers for a humanitarian aid group were all convicted in federal court last month on charges related to leaving food and water in the desert for migrants. It remains to be seen how the judge's findings impact other humanitarian aid groups along the border. Nancy Montoya followed the trial and explains how we got here.
The Cabeza Prieta National Wildlife Refuge in southern Arizona is 860,000 acres of hot and desolate land. 56 miles of this unforgiving wilderness borders Mexico. In May 2001, 14 out of a group of 26 migrants were found dead of heat exposure near Yuma. The area became known as the Devil's Highway. The incident focused international attention on migrants suffering unspeakable deaths in the Cabeza Prieta area. The tragedy also gave birth to volunteer groups like Humane Borders and the Samaritans, focused on getting water to desperate border crossers. In 2005, a new group calling itself No More Deaths was more vocal about its views on border patrol. These volunteers were younger, more aggressive, and often from out of state.
I don't know if you know this.
The Reverend Robin Hoover, then a member of Humane Borders, is part of the old guard when it comes to humanitarian work along the border.
Is there a big difference between how they do it now and how you did it then?
There are huge differences. No More Death is not a corporation. It does not have a board of directors. It does not have media representatives per se, etc. It's just not the same kind of an organization.
No More Deaths is known for challenging Border Patrol at every turn.
Would you call No More Deaths a more radical group than perhaps the Samaritans or some of the other aid groups? We seem to see No More Deaths being more vocal.
Sure, No More Deaths is very vocal.
Catherine Gaffney moved to Tucson 10 years ago from New York, specifically to volunteer to do remote desert treks for No More Deaths and leave food and water for migrants.
We are in allyship, and every group in this movement is a piece of the puzzle. So first of all, Samaritans, Humane Borders, Derechos Humanos, and really immigrant justice groups across the country, we're all in this together.
Now, during the summer of 2017, 4 women with No More Deaths set out in a 4-wheel drive vehicle on a dirt road and then hiked to a trail in a remote area of Cabeza Prieta. They knew migrants would use the trail after crossing the border illegally. The women left several gallons of water jugs and self-opening cans of beans. They had no permit to enter the protected wildlife refuge, but they chose to go anyway. They thought there would be little or no repercussions because in the past there were only warnings by refuge staff and Border Patrol to stay out. Recent citations, yes. Prosecution, no. But several months after that trip, in the summer of 2017, volunteers say the Border Patrol appeared to change the policy from only citing volunteers to pushing for prosecution. But the Border Patrol claims they're only enforcing the policies on the books. The 4 women volunteers went on trial in mid-January. It all culminated here in Tucson in front of a federal magistrate. Now, cameras are not allowed inside the federal courthouse, but that didn't stop supporters of No More Deaths from packing the courtroom all 3 days of the trial. And it didn't stop them from showing their presence outside of the courthouse. At the end of the 3-day trial, U.S. Magistrate Judge Bernardo Velasco convicted the 4 volunteers on all charges. Now, while they may have lost the legal battle, Catherine Gaffney maintains No More Deaths won the information wars.
We laid out a really compelling case. We succeeded in putting the border crisis on trial and really putting pressure on the government to answer, why are you prosecuting humanitarian aid volunteers when thousands of people are dying in this desert?
That there are people who are being targeted every day in these borderlands.
And, says Gaffney, there will be no changes in how No More Deaths carries out their mission. Now, taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture is ACLU Arizona attorney Billy Peard. He says, don't look at the recent conviction as a loss. Instead, look at the groundwork defense attorneys laid for an appeal.
The attorneys in these cases, from what I can tell, have thrown a lot of resources at it. They've made a lot of really important motions, pretrial motions, on a number of different discrete legal issues, any one of which of those arguments could win the day. So in other words, if there's a conviction in the next week in this case, and it goes up on appeal, if any one of the several pretrial motions that had been filed win on appeal, that ought to be enough to overturn the convictions.
Defense attorneys are planning an appeal, and they are preparing for more trials of No More Deaths volunteers for similar infractions later this spring, with the same judge presiding.
Frankly, No More Deaths is a community of people of conscience who volunteer their time to go out into the desert where we know thousands are dying and put out water and do simple acts of basic human kindness that respond.
While there is disagreement among some migrant aid groups on the tactics of No More Deaths, there is no argument when it comes to their mission.
I absolutely will affirm anybody that wants to get water in the desert. You know, it has to be there.
While the mission of No More Deaths is to leave water in the desert to save lives, in the long run, their greatest contribution, they say, may just be their battles in court.
Okay, so
Peard of the ACLU agrees.
If there's a legal victory on the part of the humanitarian aid workers, I would hope that that would send a signal to the local community that their humanitarian aid mission over the last 20 plus years has been vindicated in some way, and that they can feel more confident in going out into the desert and doing the important work that they're doing.
Welcome back to our panel. I want to talk about an election that took place over the weekend that some people may not have been aware of. Dan, let's start with you. What does it say about the Republican Party in Arizona?
Well, Kelly Ward was elected to lead the Republican Party in Arizona, and she was a failed candidate in the Senate, and she was on the radar a long time ago. She was openly critical of Senator John McCain, and she is a bomb thrower. And this says something about what direction apparently the party wants to go, very hard right. I think she has some good leadership qualities, but is this the kind of Republican that your vanilla-flavored Republican really wants to be associated with? We'll see. I think the Republican and the Democratic parties have bigger issues, and that is the fact that the independent voter is growing in Arizona. Nobody wants to be associated with the party. So they may have bigger issues than trying to sell Kelly Ward to the GOP.
Sarah, does this challenge the party overall in the state?
Well, I think it does in the sense of if you take into account everyone who is registered as a Republican. I know there are a lot of people who are, I'm a fiscal conservative, but I don't agree with President Trump or Dr. Kelly Ward. I mean, I think in one sense, you can't say, well, the GOP really is, we're more middle of the road, we don't agree with Trump, blah, blah, blah. When your party is being led by Dr. Kelly Ward. The Republicans who don't agree with that need to get involved, be part of the process, and the question is, will that ever happen?
Hank, do the average Republicans look at Kelly Ward as extreme right wing?
Well, define average Republicans these days. I mean, this is the party of Donald Trump. So do the people who are, in the party of Donald Trump look at Kelly Ward as an extremist? No. But do the people who are in more the party of Doug Ducey look at Kelly Ward as an extremist? Absolutely. It is a war between those two wings of the party, and right now the farther right wing just took over Arizona's party.
And that's a very good point. This is now a party that says John McCain is not Republican enough, Jeff Flake is not Republican enough, and you do have to take Kelly Ward's statements and you have them on a political level and then you have them on a personal level, and she is no holds barred. She is a bomb thrower, and but to Sarah's point, does it really matter who the chairwoman of the Republican Party is in Arizona? Do most Republicans really know or care? What kind of influence does that have? Well, it may that person may help bring more money into the state, and they actually may influence who's going to end up on the ballot. Ultimately, we decide, though. The voters decide.
All right, you brought up the state legislature earlier. I want to talk about this. More diverse, we have more women, more minorities, more Democrats finally. Will that change the climate at the Arizona State Legislature? Any guesses, Sarah?
Every session starts with, this is the time we're going to be bipartisan, and then it invariably kind of separates. I think some of the more caustic members of the legislature may have been somewhat chastened or voted out of office. So I hope so. I'm hopeful. It's what we need to have happen, but I don't know.
Okay, Dan?
On occasion, Democrats have good ideas, but they haven't been heard for many, many years in the state legislature. I think now with a much narrower margin for the Republicans, I'm hoping that this will change things and that it will be more collaborative and there will be more compromise. There will be a little bit more diplomacy and civility, but it's not going to happen.
Take these two data points. The state Senate has not heard a Democratic bill in committee yet. All the talk of bipartisanship, every single bill that's gone to committee so far has been a Republican bill, just like every year before it. The state House just changed the rules to limit debate. The idea was to keep Democrats from talking and talking and talking on. It's not a kumbaya up there, no matter what they're saying. The governor made a big show about, Katie Hobbs, my partner at, the Secretary of State's office, and, Democrats here in the chambers, but at the end of the day, it's business as usual at the Capitol.
Okay, why don't we come back in April or May and have the same conversation? We'll see if we have anything to refer to. All right, my thanks to all three of you.
Thanks.
And that's all for now. Thanks for joining us. We'd like to hear your feedback. You can visit us on social media and let us know what you think. We'll see you next week.